Hey, Will.
Yeah.
What car, if you could choose, what car would you make a time machine out of?
That's a good question. 2013 Nissan Sentra.
That's a good choice.
'Cause that's the car I got in a wreck in.
Oh my god. This is episode 7 of I Finally Saw, where today I finally saw Back to the Future. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to this little discussion about an 80s classic. I'm joined once again by Will.
Hello.
I caught him in the middle of taking a sip. I'm joined by Andromeda. And I am joined by Liz.
Yeah, what's up, Doc?
That's wonderful. Well, yes, as detailed in the intro and the title, today we're talking about Back to the Future. So just to kind of introduce it a little bit, here is a little snippet from Google, because I am too lazy to write anything on my own. In this 1980s sci-fi classic, small-town California teen Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox, is thrown back into the 50s when an experiment by his eccentric scientist friend Doc Brown, portrayed by Christopher Lloyd, goes awry. Traveling through time in a modified DeLorean, Marty encounters younger versions of his parents, portrayed by Crispin Glover and Lea Thompson, and must make sure that they fall in love or he'll cease to exist. Even more dauntingly, Marty has to return to his own time and save the life of Doc Brown.
Steven Spielberg presents Back to the Future, a Robert Zemeckis film.
Well, just to sort of kick things off here, I want to kind of do as we usually do and open it up to everybody to kind of talk about how familiar they are with this movie. So let's start with Will. Will, how familiar are you with Back to the Future?
Very familiar. I've seen it a good amount of times to know just about everything about it. So mainly the first one, not so much the other two. But yeah, I'm familiar.
I am the only one on the panel that hasn't seen the movie until before recording, but I feel like I'm just familiar and that it's just a classic. Like, it's one of those movies that everyone has seen except for me, and honestly, I'll get into my thoughts of it later in the episode, but I kind of would rather keep it that way. But in any case, I am familiar through like word of mouth of people being like, it's a good movie, definitely a must watch.
So I've seen the first two Back to the Futures a very, very, very long time ago when I was younger. And then just recently rewatched it for the podcast. But I think Back to the Future is one of those movies that even if you haven't seen it, there is so much media that we consume all the time that references it or looks like it, that even if you haven't seen this movie, you could sometimes say that I've seen Back to the Future just through Back to the Future references.
This was a movie that I didn't see for the longest time growing up, but I was always super aware of it. And I remember as a kid, it felt almost strangely momentous for me when I was like, I finally got the opportunity to see it, because I think it was just, I don't even remember. I think it was like finally available to rent at like my local video store because it was always out. I was so excited, and ever since then it's just been a movie that I always sort of find myself coming back to very frequently.
Marty leads an ordinary life.
No McFly ever amounted to anything in the history of Hill Valley. Yeah, well, history is going to change.
I guess at this point I kind of want to talk a little bit about the history of Back to the Future, because this is like a movie that's very sort of infamous for its production troubles. To begin with, the movie was sort of inspired, I think, by the sort of two people that were frontrunners on this project were producer Bob Gale and then director Robert Zemeckis. They were kind of friends, and Gale had stumbled across an old yearbook that used to belong to his father and had realized that his dad was the, I believe, class president back in high school. And so that sort of spawned this question, which eventually sort of became the premise in some ways for especially the original movie, which is just if you were back in high school with your parents, do you think that you would have been friends? And that sort of then becomes all these other, that was sort of pitched around, and that became a script. And rather infamously, this was a movie that was, studios weren't eager to back it for a number of reasons. I think it was rejected over 40 times before a studio finally decided to back it. Most studios, from what I understand, were apprehensive to back it because they didn't think the movie was raunchy enough. In my understanding, a lot of the comedies that were really successful at that time were R-rated. And this was kind of, they could kind of parse that this was like something that was probably going to be in like a PG sort of a thing. So most studios kind of passed on it because they thought it was, I guess, too kiddie. Except for Disney, who rather infamously passed on the movie because I believe the person that they met was like, you're having us make a movie about incest. What the heck is the matter with you? So they were like, that's not our brand. And initially they were very apprehensive to get Spielberg on as a producer credit because they were like, if this movie flops, we're just going to become the two guys that only get work because we're friends with Spielberg. But eventually they decided to kind of use the power his name had to sort of produce the movie. And of course, they really wanted Marty McFly to be played by Michael J. Fox. But at the time, Michael J. Fox was in a sitcom whose name escapes me right now. And so that had a very rigorous production schedule. And so the people that were in charge of that sitcom were like, you can't have Michael J. Fox. And so instead they got Eric Stoltz. And they shot for 5 weeks with Eric before finally kind of realizing it's just not working, because Eric is not a bad actor. He's a really talented actor, but in sort of the words of Zemeckis, I believe, he said, like, Eric was taking the movie very seriously, and you kind of needed a character, or you needed an actor that was going to sort of bring to the forefront the kind of innate kind of comedic aspects of the script. And Eric just wasn't doing that. He was taking it very seriously. He's kind of a method actor, and kind of, I think there was another movie he worked on where he was like, I need everybody to call me by my character name. And, you know, he was very disciplined. And so it just wasn't meshing. And so he gets fired, and a lot of the other actors on the movie, like Christopher Lloyd, who played Doc Brown, and I believe it's Thomas Wilson, who played Biff, kind of talked about that, like, they were all sort of nervous that they were going to get fired too as a result. But eventually they managed to work something out, and Michael J. Fox was able to come onto the movie, and he had a ridiculous personal life schedule during the production of this movie, because he's like making TV in the day, and he would get into the back of a van or something, and he would like sleep on the drive over to the Universal lot for like 2 hours, and he was filming a lot of his scenes in Back to the Future in like the early hours of the morning. So this movie was a bit of a production hell in more ways than one, which makes the way it sort of turned out, I think, kind of interesting. But that's just a little bit of a history lesson on the movie that I thought was really interesting.
And 1985 is not his year. But Dr. Brown is about to change all that.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine? What of a DeLorean?
I have thoughts about this movie. I have a lot of complicated thoughts about this movie because it is so well loved. And I was surprised. I'm not even necessarily surprised, but looking on Letterboxd after watching it and seeing how many people were giving this movie 4.5 to 5-star reviews, because I really did not enjoy it as much as I thought I would. You hear about how iconic it is and how quintessential of a viewing experience it is, as far as movies go, as far as 80s movies go, as far as time travel movies go. And I don't think I found the story at all nearly as compelling as a lot of people did. I think the real driving force of this movie relies a lot on some rather unsavory concepts, and I think a lot of the movie hinges on this really strange dynamic between Marty and his mom and Marty and his dad in the past, and it just sort of puts a sour taste in my mouth as far as movies go. And there's some other little bits and pieces of the movie that do the exact same thing. But yeah, I was shocked that I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I did. I think there's some really cool parts of this movie, and I think there's parts that were made just purely to have a factor of coolness to them. The time traveling in a car absolutely is a stunning image and super cool. And the scene with the license plate twirling in the wake of the car tires with the flames, it's cool. Or the big speaker blowing out and throwing Marty across the room at the beginning. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are really cool in concept, but when put together with the overarching themes and story, I don't think make a cohesive and satisfying story.
I honestly don't like the movie at all, if I'm going to be honest with you. And I knew I would because the very first frame of the movie said it's a Steven Spielberg film. And it's no surprise that I don't like Steven Spielberg. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it on the podcast before. And there's a lot of Spielberg-esque stuff going on, but beyond that, I agree a lot. I don't like the story. I don't like a lot of... Well, it's hard because I like Robert Zemeckis movies. I like Forrest Gump, despite the fact that even that movie is problematic. And I feel like if I were to have seen it when I was younger, like I did with Forrest Gump, I would feel very differently than I do right now. But I think it's similar to Old Boy in that I can still understand why it's a masterpiece, despite the fact that I have contradicting opinions to the vast majority of people.
I like it. Maybe it's something I definitely did grow up with, like seeing it. But I think mostly I like the idea of someone going back in time and then not finding a way out. I think that what makes Eric Stoltz's performance, that from what we've kind of seen, more interesting, because he kind of treated it like it was a horror film, and thinking about that would probably have been more interesting to me than what we got. But I get it. It's Spielberg. He wanted to make it more like lighthearted and whatnot. But
well, considering I'm dressed like this, I feel like you can probably surmise that I have some amount of positive feelings about this movie. It's a movie that I do feel kind of split about some of its aspects. I think I've always sort of looked at it that I do kind of tend to lean more towards the crowd of people that say that like this is a movie that is very quintessential in a lot of aspects. But I do also recognize certain things in the movie that I understand, like as years have gone on, have kind of put people off to it. I think I've sort of looked at it always as a commentary about nostalgia. Especially, I think at the time, this was like a period of time in the United States when there was a lot of sort of like, at least to my knowledge, a lot of like, kind of what we're doing to the 80s now. And we're sort of doing throughout the 2010s of just like, oh man, the 80s was like the best decade ever. Where there was a lot of like suburban America that was, I guess, sort of feeling that way about like the 50s and 60s. Where they sort of like, oh, I wish we could go back to that like sort of, I guess, pre-Watergate time of pre-Vietnam sort of era of innocence. And they initially kind of lean into that in the movie, where you have the 80s and Hill Valley downtown as like all of these like adult stores, and the movie theater is no longer a Cineplex, it's playing like adult movies. And when Marty first gets back to the 50s, he's like, they're playing Mr. Sandman, and there's all these sort of things. But over the course of the movie, I feel like it kind of starts to sort of... There's a Harold Ramis movie that does something very similar, and I wish I could remember what it was called. But it sort of starts to devolve into this kind of showcase of just like the 50s also had problems and their own sort of brand of misery. Like obviously the way that like Biff and his sort of behavior is almost sort of like enabled by a lot of people in the movie, and that's the big example. And the other big example is like there's a lot of like racism directed at a lot of the black people in the movie, like Mr. Wilson, like the band that plays. I've always sort of looked at that as like Zemeckis kind of being like, yeah, no, the 50s also had stuff. It wasn't just this sort of beautiful picturesque Americana, and his sort of the sort of the deception that kind of comes with historical nostalgia. The other big thing about it is obviously the way sort of Lorraine is portrayed, and there is kind of an air of there is kind of an aspect of it that I can see it being very I don't know, like she can kind of come off as very sort of indecisive, as sort of on her whims, in the way it seems like she very quickly kind of goes from Marty and George. And the other thing obviously is just the nature of their relationship with Marty and George, or Marty and Lorraine, the way they sort of are. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It is weird. And I guess to me it's always been a sort of thing where it's just kind of like I think they kind of are towing the line with it. And I'm obviously not, I mean, I'm not a woman, so obviously like my sort of stance on it is probably like it's not the same, and so I don't have the same like perspective on it. But for me it's just kind of this thing of just like I think they go just far enough. I remember reading an interview where the two Bobs is what they sort of call themselves, or they sort of talked about how they were very particular about like they knew that like the farthest they could really push it in terms of the physicality of it was probably the kiss, because anything more than that and it starts to border on exploitive, or it is just flat out exploitive. And the other big thing was they felt it was really important that the person who ultimately pulls away from the entire relationship is Lorraine. And I remember reading something about like someone could kind of point at that and be like, what the heck is she talking about? How does she pick up on the weird sort of tones about the relationship with Marty if she has no reason to believe that they're related? And they sort of talked about like it doesn't really matter because the audience doesn't want that relationship to happen, so they'll believe that she has the intuition to realize that even if she doesn't know if Marty is her son, that it's wrong. But it is also, I mean, the fact of the matter is that you can kind of put all these things into these frame of references and these specific sort of points about intention and give them sort of context. But the other thing about it is that like, and I don't mean to I don't mean to invalidate when I say all of these things. I just sort of like talking about context, but it is a poignant point where it's just like you can put all of these things and kind of elaborate on your sort of perspective, but like the fact of the matter is if it makes somebody uncomfortable, you can't logic your way out of that. Like if somebody is like, that thing on the screen that feels gross and weird and I don't like that, you know, there's nothing wrong with that per se, not with the stuff that's happening on screen, but how they feel. Like that is all incredibly valid, and even if you kind of put that into words and explain that for people or something and they're still like, yeah, I understand that, but that's just feel weird, then like, yeah, you know, you can't. So it's the kind of thing where it's like I have my sort of understanding of it, and I've invested sort of time, and I've, you know, thought about it, and I've hit a sort of point where I'm like, I recognize what they're trying to do, and to a certain level I don't think this to me feels as exploitive or as weird or as malicious as other things that are out there. But also that's my frame of reference, and if somebody's just like, yeah, flat out, I don't like it no matter how much I've kind of come to understand it, then I think that is entirely valid. I'm sorry, did somebody want to say something? I've been rambling for
No, I think you summed up everything we all feel, to be honest with you.
Oh.
But I also think more so it almost gives the movie too much credit to be like, well, Lorraine did choose ultimately to not be with him, but the movie never really gave her any like that much autonomy to begin with. Like what Marty literally said at one point, she wants to go to the dance with you. She just doesn't know it yet. And it like a lot of the things that he says and the other men in the movie say are similar to that, and it's gross.
I think that you're right in the sense that the directors wanted to show how things might not have been entirely pleasant in the 50s, and there are bits and pieces of racism and sexism thrown in there that are incredibly intentional to show that life in the 50s wasn't all that it adds up to be. And a lot of what we feel about the past is nostalgia, and we don't see the darker side, the more bigoted side of everything that happened during those periods of time. And I think that's true for some of the ways that characters who aren't white are treated throughout the movie, characters who are women are treated throughout the movie. However, they make a point to include in the time that the movie takes place in the 80s, this very interesting scene right when they're about to go back in time where two Middle Eastern looking gentlemen show up in a Winnebago and they start shooting at Doc Brown, and Doc Brown's like, "Oh no, the Libyans." And it's very interesting because why did you have to make the people who come after you look brown? And that, I don't know if that was an intentional choice or not, and it didn't take place during the 50s. So it sort of undercuts, I think, the idea that maybe they included racism as a way to off-put the sort of nostalgic feelings that we have for the past. Adding on to that, there's the scene where Marty McFly gives Goldie the idea to become mayor, an idea that had Marty McFly not gone to the past, Goldie would have never thought up on his own. He's in the diner and he seems shocked by it, and he's like, "Mayor, I like the sound of that." And I think that goes beyond the idea of these little bits of racism that were thrown in for deconstructing nostalgia, and more to the idea that the movie itself definitely shows its biases. And to ignore that would be creating a guise of nostalgia for the 80s that is not entirely true.
I think it's just an unfortunate byproduct of like, these are just like two middle-aged white guys, and so they are just like, wouldn't it be funny? Because in their minds, that's all it is a setup and payoff. It's like, okay, we set up that this guy's the mayor in the beginning of the movie. Wouldn't it be funny to kind of set up to like pay that off and be like, now that Marty's kind of gone back in time? And that's the sort of thing, is that like Back to the Future is very sort of loosey-goosey with its time travel rules. And so it's like, is he like always responsible for that, or is it just he's kind of ensured that it happens and all that? And so the other example of that is obviously the Chuck Berry joke. We have now inadvertently implied, like, they just probably thought it was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if like that's like Chuck Berry's cousin, without like kind of considering the ramifications of like, hey, this like really historically popular Chuck Berry song was inadvertently created by a white guy now in history. So those are sort of things where it's just kind of like, I think it is sort of like the life experience of the people involved kind of shining through. It's just like that didn't occur to them because they probably didn't check with those people. So there is all of that. There is sort of like a sort of an anecdote related to all of that I thought was kind of interesting, which is, so yeah, Tom Wilson, who played Biff, kind of talked about how, and he's talked about over the years, how this was like a really hard movie for him to do, because in high school, like, he was the person that was often getting bullied Like, he was like, I had never really been a bully in my life, according to him. There's a scene where he's attempting to assault Lorraine in the car, and that in between takes, he kept apologizing to Lea Thompson about it. Like, he just kept saying, I'm so sorry. Apparently, Lea Thompson basically had to, like, comfort him and be like, Tom, it's just acting. Which I thought was kind of strangely... It feels weird to say. It's, like, almost sweet in a sort of way, but it's still just like, oh, right, but we're doing this. Will, how do you feel about the ending for this movie?
I mean, it's very simple in a way. And it ends off with, what are they going to do in the sequel? Like, it leads straight to the sequel, and they basically reshot it, I think, in the second movie, in the opening.
Yeah.
Because they had a new actress. Yeah, it definitely kind of differentiates itself in a way. Like, it's not a single thing, like, now I have to watch the other one, which is not as good compared to the first one.
Well, I bring it up because, rather infamously, Crispin Glover, who of course played George McFly, didn't like the ending to this movie. And he made a really big stink about it on set. He said it glorifies capitalistic and monetary ideals, that the happy ending for the family is they're all rich and attractive and have good jobs and all that. And the directors and I guess people in charge just kind of took the approach of just like, we don't care, Crispin, which is one way of handling it. But I don't know. I was just curious. It's an interesting point, because his sort of argument was like, they don't, like, you can have the family be happy and they don't have to be financially well off. Like, George can still be an author and they don't have to be financially well off. Like, his argument was like, the reward and the happy ending should just be that the family is happy.
I think he was, but I don't like the ending for a different reason. And I was looking at some reviews, and I didn't even think of it when I finished the movie. I don't know what I really thought, but once I read the review, I realized, like, yeah, I think the ending's actually really sad. In that, like, Marty did a lot of things that he shouldn't have done, at least in terms of, like, changing the past. And coming back to the future, for lack of better terms, he is in a reality that's completely different than what he knew. And I think for me personally, if I did that and everything was different, I would probably like go insane, to be honest with you. I think it's hard to like talk to anyone and be like, hey, like, do you remember the time we did this? And they're like, no. What are you talking about? You're insane. And then I'm like, no, like, this is like, we're in a relationship, or like we had this experience together, whatever it may be. I feel like is actually its own kind of hell, and like really sad, to be honest with you.
That is an interesting point, because you have to consider how many familial bonding moments between Marty and his siblings or Marty and his parents were changed because they are now wealthy and in a completely different economic standing. And in the case of his father, have incredibly different personalities altogether. What would it be like to have this idea of who your father is built up in your head, to come back to the future and have a completely different person who you only recognize as your father because they share the same face?
They also like changed the dynamic between Marty's dad and Biff. Like, Biff was the rich one, and then like they completely switched that, and it's kind of like Biff's broke now, or he's have to go up to Marty's dad for everything now, and like they switched roles.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, it's something that to me never really like occurred, because they make such a like point to kind of almost to a comical degree kind of show like how miserable the family is in the past, which is like kind of funny to look back on now, because honestly, even when they were poor, they were actually, honestly, from the look of things, they were actually pretty well off. But I guess it's just how times have changed, that Marty's family is considered pretty, I guess, in poor standing in the original 1985 timeline. But like his older brother's working at like McDonald's. I guess the only thing they could come up with for her sister is that she's looks odd. They're like, how do we make her look miserable? I don't know. She dresses like Mabel. Like, I don't. It's just like that's the only thing they could come up with. Ironic. The thing that I thought was interesting is that like George doesn't dye his hair in the rectified timeline. In the old timeline, he's got like the dyed hair, and then his son makes a joke about that. And then like in the new timeline, he just lets his grays come in. But he's like inattentive and kind of stupid. He's like watching the TV while his wife is like recounting how they met. And she's like, oh, you know, it was this wonderful date. Do you remember that day, George? And he's like, what, Lorraine? What? He's like, that like at first glance, yeah, when you see the new rectified timeline and everybody's like hanging out and we love each other so much and we're rich now, that like as a kid in a fairy tale setting, you really don't sort of think about the ramifications of that. Where it's just kind of like, yeah, his dad sucked before, so now it's great. Where it's just like, yeah, if that really happened, that would be kind of freaky. As if like you left and you came back one day and your family was now like perfect. And the emotional like fallout of that, I mean, I don't even know. And it's so strange because like so much of the rest of the world seems to be unaffected. Like his girlfriend's the same, basically. I do want to highlight one specific scene that for me personally, actually, I do think really works. I call it the Earth Angel scene, when the band is playing Earth Angel and Marty is playing with the band. Because for me personally, I think it is a scene in the movie where I think all of its little things finally kind of come together. Michael J. Fox is just really, I really just love him in this role. Him and his dynamic with Christopher Lloyd is just like, the entire time it's just them two on screen. Whenever it's just them two on screen, it just puts a big smile on my face. And we'll probably talk about this if and when we get to the other movies, but it's why I'm actually like really grateful that they decided to go the route of switching the emotional core of the franchise in later movies from Marty and his family to Marty and Doc. Because I think in terms of like, if you're gonna keep that story going, that's a much more interesting emotional center for this story. There's that moment where he's like dying basically, and the band is playing, and I am a sucker for diegetic music that is appropriate to the scene. And it's just all these little things of just kind of like, we're not out of the woods yet, because George had like one kind of freak accident moment of confidence, but can he keep that up? And that's what that whole scene is sort of trying to display, is that like he had that one moment where he stood up to Biff, but is he really a changed person? And him kind of like coming off onto that like snot-nosed brat, and he literally just shoves him to the floor, and like the music is building, and like as soon as he takes her, finally like the main vocalist comes in and he's like, what is the line? The vision of my happiness or something. And then on top of the diegetic music, we now have the Alan Silvestri's score, which I love the score for this movie. It's one of my favorite scores. And that meshes with the diegetic music, and it, to me, actually is a sort of little like, and like, it almost looks sped up, but it's the shot when they finally kiss, and it just cuts to Marty, and he's just like, he pops up like a Muppet and stands up, and it looks like the shot is sped up or something, but it like, that's like a little moment for me where it's just, I don't know, for me it all really does kind of come together, and I think that's actually like rather sweet, and I think on a technical and a performance level it really does work for me.
I think there are some good performances in here. I think Doc Brown really steals every scene he's in. And I'm the kind of person who loves an actor who just absolutely hams it up. So that part was great for me, just having a man just be as unhinged and crazy as possible on screen. It's good entertainment, and I think the Doc Brown character is really strong, and I wish, quite honestly, that he was in this movie more. And it's true that, like, in the second one, the focus does shift from Marty and his family to Marty and Doc, and I guess I had misremembered it, but I really thought that Doc Brown was a bigger part of it. I mean, obviously he's integral to the story, but he's mostly at the start and the end, and there is this big chunk of time right in the middle where he's not there at all. But I do think his performance is fantastic. I do like Marty McFly. I think he is a very expressive actor and really good at showing his emotions with his face. There's a lot of scenes where he like pops up at the dance or like does a double take and turns around, and you can just tell exactly what he's thinking. I find that very impressive. As far as the other performances, I wasn't particularly wowed. I think there's a mischaracterization with young 50s era George, and his performance sort of stuck out to me because I found it jarring just how he had these little moments of charm in there. And maybe it's because I think young George looks kind of attractive. But he has these little moments of charm, but he is supposed to be this really awkward dude and not supposed to know how to talk to girls. So I thought it was a little weird that he seemed to be playing the character more suave than what the script, I think, intended.
Yeah, George is kind of an interesting character because he's not quite a stereotypical nerd, and how we sort of imagine, especially that portrayal in like even though this takes place in like the 50s, like that sort of image, I think of it kind of deriving from around the 80s. Because he doesn't have like the big thick rimmed glasses. He's not very nasally. When we think of nerds, we think of very like some nasally sound, but his voice is very breathy. It's very at the front of his voice, and he's like, "I'm George," you know. And I think I do kind of get where you're coming from, where he's so much of a disaster that it kind of is jarring at times when he does have these occasional moments of being very sweet. There is one moment that does kind of warm my heart a little bit, which is when he immediately checks in with Lorraine after he knocks Biff out. And there's just something about the way he says, "Are you okay?" that like kind of makes me want to say, "Oh." But I don't know. I think I'm kind of strange in that like I think I would have liked them leaning a little bit more into him occasionally having these moments, because I think like it kind of helps. I don't know. I watched this movie with Dayton in preparation, and we talked about something that we would have liked to have seen, like a small moment or two with Lorraine and George, very like kind of early on into the 50s part of the movie, that kind of establishes that like regardless of Marty's involvement, there was a genuine spark there. Like we were kind of saying, like Lorraine is always kind of seen in the movie carrying books, which is obviously because she's in school, but we were like, maybe she should have been like an avid reader. And so there's like the classic, like they bump into each other and the things go everywhere, and she like reads George's stories and she's like, oh, like this is really cool, like I've never read like science fiction, or maybe she's a big science fiction fan or something. And like that's part of the reason George is interested in writing science fiction, is because he knows that. So something like that to like shows, because there's like hints of that. There's that moment where Marty asks, like, did George really not ever ask you to the dance or something? And she's like, well, he's really cute, or he's kind of cute and all. So it's like they hint that like regardless of Marty's involvement, there is something there. But because, especially with the way they met with George being a peeping Tom, which, like, I want to say a side note. I want to go see the Back to the Future musical, which was worth the price of entry just to see how they handle all the DeLorean shenanigans on stage. That was really cool. But that moment, that scene in the movie is like George's big solo. him on the tree. They turned that into a song, and that's his big solo. It's called My Myopia. And the most frustrating thing to me is that, melodically speaking, it's the most interesting and catchy song in the show that isn't a piece of licensed music. But anyways, yeah, like, considering all of that, like, stuff around that, I would have liked a scene that, like, fleshed out Lorraine a little bit more and, like, helped set up and establish an actual precedent for why she might have liked George outside of just Marty or George's actions and involvement with her. So I think, I don't know, I do kind of get that idea that, like, it kind of is in contrast to the way the movie presents him, but I do agree. I do think Crispin Glover is low-key kind of, you know, there's something there that I'm like, I kind of see it. It's his eyes. There's something about his eyes. But,
I feel like just you need to give Lorraine more autonomy and then give us a reason to actually root for the relationship. Because, like, I think in hearing your guys' conversation of it, like, I see what you guys are saying, but they just need more time to establish them as a couple. And, I mean, make me want to root for them, other than Marty being like, "Oh, I'm about to disappear if my parents don't get together."
I guess that is a pretty. I forgot about that he's gonna literally die.
They also just needed to change the way they framed women in general. Like, the first scene we see with Jennifer, the quote-unquote love interest, I guess. Like, she walks up to him, to Marty, and Marty is looking at these two women literally just walking to their aerobics class. And he's, like, looking at their bodies, and then Jennifer's grabbing him, and she's like, "Eyes up here, buddy. Like, why are you looking at these women when I'm with you?" And I think, like, stuff like that was in the movie just didn't need to be added in the first place. And even if you are playing it off as a joke, I, again, don't really see a point in it.
Will, what about you? How do you feel about the...
I mean, you basically answered everything. I didn't want to... I feel like I'm rude trying to budge into stuff, but
this man
another
is
thing I
impeding
wanted to
us.
touch on. Another thing I wanted to touch on was how one thing I liked was how once we got finished with the story with his parents trying to get them together, and he's like, "Oh, now this has happened," and he has to go now back to Doc Brown, and you're like, "Oh wait, there's this going on." It was paced out really well. I do wish there was more Doc in the middle of it, because I think that's what makes it more exciting. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot. There's this whole other, we have to go back to the future now. So how are we going to do that now that my parents are together? I'm not going to disappear. So
On that too, on the Doc Brown of it all, the first shot, the establishing shot of the movie is this very intense Rube Goldberg type machine that Doc Brown created, and I think it's a bit of a disservice that is how the movie is established, with this invention from your hammiest character, and just to not include that character for a good majority of the movie is very interesting.
He's sending Marty 30 years back in time.
It works! It's a flying saucer from outer space!
Now he's trapped in the past.
It's gotta be a dream.
So I think we're going to start transitioning here over to sort of wrapping it up now. And so I want to, starting with Andromeda, I want to ask, would you recommend this movie to people?
I would not recommend this movie to people. And it's funny because a lot of movies like this that are, classics, I kind of feel prideful in not watching. And this was one of the movies I wished I did not watch.
So I've ruined your streak, is what you're saying. This is all my fault.
I fear I did finally see this movie.
I generally resent the idea that you have to watch a movie just because it is a classic piece of media. But for all of the things that I have put this movie through on the show, I think there is value in watching it. Just because so many other things reference this movie and take inspiration from this movie in order to understand context for the other media that you consume in the modern day. I think this is a good piece of media to watch to make yourself more educated on everything that happens and all the things that were birthed because of this original time-traveling car idea.
Like Liz said, it's definitely a classic, and it's kind of hard to do that to people that haven't grown up with this movie, like Andromeda. So it does generally depend on, I don't know, like if you like those like goofy time travel movies like Hot Tub Time Machine, or what's another one?
Bill and Ted.
That's the only one I can think of. But like if you, yeah, Bill and Ted. If you want to like just watch just your run and go time travel movie, and you want to like, I don't know, just enjoy something like that, then yeah, I'd recommend it to people. But there are various amounts of problematic things that don't age well. Period. So.
Boy, we're gonna make all those 80s heads really happy with this episode. But you know, I mean, that was always the crux of the show, was to be honest. And I think inauthentic is, I don't know, what's another big word? Antithetical to the point. But yeah, I don't know. I'm very torn because I grew up with this movie, and I think I'm always gonna have that sort of bias, like that bias towards it, because I do think there are a lot of things in this movie that are genuinely brilliant. I think there are a lot of things in this movie that are really well scripted. I think this is a movie that is really well shot, has some of my favorite blocking, like, which is kind of an innocuous thing. I love a lot of the cinematography. I love a lot of the iconography. I think even some of the costuming, obviously, is kind of iconic in its own sort of way. I love the score, and there are things in this movie that I can kind of look at and be like, that's weird, and that's perfectly understandable if it makes somebody uncomfortable. But I think for me, I do generally feel comfortable recommending this movie to folks, and I think it sort of depends. I think it's a lot with sort of younger people, because I think that sort of awareness has been very sort of ingrained in a lot of internet culture. It's, I think, understandable why those sort of things are very questionable, like we talk a lot about, because, and we didn't talk about it here but as much, but you know, like again, like sort of the portrayal of the terrorists, because like you see that a lot, I think, with like 80s movies where it's like because like with the Cold War was kind of going on, and so, and 9/11 obviously hadn't happened, and so like terrorists were sort of this like easy fantastical blanket thing that you could just kind of throw out. And I do have to be honest, like there was a moment rewatching it for this movie when I was just like, this feels a little Team America. That all being said, I think the stuff that I like about this movie is ingrained enough and special enough to me that I think I am generally pretty willing to recommend it to people. Yeah, I think there are, depending on, you know, what you sort of take away from it, there's either, I think, moments of brilliance or something that is memorable. And for that reason, I think I would have to recommend it to people. But yeah.
Michael J. Fox.
Whoa, this is heavy.
Christopher Lloyd.
There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
Back to the Future.
Well, I think that's going to bring this initial discussion to a close. I want to once again thank all my panelists for taking the time to be here. And I love you all, and good night.